Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see everyone. My name is Sheriff John Allen. We're going to have a press conference over our latest deputy-involved shooting. But before, we have Chief Deputy Huffmeyer go over the facts of the shooting, and I'll be taking questions and have a statement after. I'd like to give my sincere condolences, first of all, to the Romero family, to make sure that our SO's heartfelt condolences are with them. We never like to see the loss of life, so I want to make sure that the family knows that. Other than that, here's Chief Deputy Huffmeyer.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. If I could just direct your attention to the screen here to my left, we'll be going through some of the facts and circumstances as we currently understand them about the incident that occurred on April 16th. So you'll see we have our agenda for today. We'll be going through our case information, the timeline. We'll be listening to the initial 911 call that was placed by the calling party in this incident. Of course, we'll be reviewing some of our body-worn camera footage, some evidentiary photos that were taken from the scene, as well as some information about the decedent, and then at the end we'll take as many questions as we can. So moving on, just so you have it, in the event that you want to IPRA any of the information for the case in the future, we do have the case number there for you, the CAD number for the incident. Again, the date and time, April 16th. The time of the initial call that was placed to dispatch happened at 9:40 a.m. The location of the incident was 2316 Griffin Road Southwest. That is in our South Area Command. There you will also see the case agent, detective that the case is currently assigned to, and then again the case and CAD information. So the timeline of events that happened that morning started again at 9:40 a.m. and that started with the calling party. That would be the decedent's father, who placed a call to dispatch requesting a welfare check be placed on his son. Those two individuals were not in the same place at the same time. The father was at his residence. The decedent had just left his residence when he made the phone call, and he was en route to his own home at 2316, and that is where the welfare check was requested. As far as we know, the decedent resided there alone, and deputies arrived on scene at approximately 9:52 to the residence there at 2316 Griffin. Deputies did enter the property, and you'll hear a portion of the 911 call. He spends, the father of the decedent spends approximately 7 minutes on the phone with dispatch. Obviously in this format, we're not going to spend 7 minutes listening to the entire call, but of course that will be available to you at the conclusion of today's press conference. We have the first chunk of it where he requests the welfare check we'll be listening to here in just a moment. In that call, he does indicate that there's a fence around the property, but that they own the property and we're welcome to go in to knock on the front door to attempt contact with the decedent. So at 9:54, deputies, and we'll show you this, knock on the front door of the residence and announce themselves as sheriff's deputies. They unfortunately don't have any contact with the subject at that time. One of the deputies on scene does make contact with a neighbor at a nearby residence who states that the subject should be home if his vehicle was present, which it was. Deputies walk around essentially the whole perimeter of the residence for quite some time attempting to make contact with the subject with no luck. And at about 10 o'clock, deputies walk back through the front gate of the property towards their patrol vehicles, which are parked there on Griffin Road. About a minute later, one of the deputies assigned to the call attempts to make contact with the subject over the telephone. We had obtained his cell phone number from the original calling party, but unfortunately were unable to get through. The call was forwarded to voicemail. Another minute after that, at about 10:02, we placed a phone call to the original calling party, the decedent's father, and that call went to voicemail as well. The intent of that call would have been to update them as to the status of the call, just to let them know that although the welfare check had been requested, we were unable to fulfill that due to a lack of contact with the subject in question. Another minute after that, and this all happens very rapidly, I can't stress that enough, as the deputies are securing some equipment in their vehicles and preparing to leave, they're out on the street. The subject exits abruptly out of the property, and in the blink of an eye is in the street and is initially running at them with a knife held to his neck. He makes several comments. We'll play the video and you'll be able to hear what he does verbalize to the deputies. He eventually stops running as he gets close to them and starts walking, continuing with some of the verbal comments that he's making. Highly agitated state, clearly in a mental state that is unwell at the time based on his actions and some of the comments that he's making. And within that same minute is when the deputies do discharge their firearms at the subject, and he did die on scene. So now we'll listen to the 911 call. Again, that call was placed by the decedent's father. And just to repeat, this is not the call in its entirety, it's just the first several minutes. But you will be provided with the entire call at the conclusion of today.
Bernalillo County Communications, this is Brittany. How may I help you?
Hey, Brittany, my name is, and I have someone that lives at 2316 Griffin Road, Southwest.
Isn't that address on your change?
2316 Griffin Road, Southwest.
Okay, sir. Sometimes that do happen.
Well, let's see, he has mental issues,
Okay.
and he has been diagnosed with delusional disorder, amongst other things, and he's been out of work for about 4 months now, and he hasn't applied for any type of assistance, for example, unemployment or anything like that. So I've been helping him along the way, and I've been asking him to apply for assistance. And he hasn't done any of it. So today I told him he came to my house, and I told him, have you applied here? And he said, no. I said, I'm not giving you any more money. This is it. I'm done. I'm not giving you any more. You have to help yourself. And he said, well, I'll go and start it. And I said, well, that's on you. That's all up to you. And he said, well, that's what I want to do. I won't die anyway. And I said, well, that's on you. It's not on me. That's on you. And he said, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go and kill myself. Well, again, that's on you, Jared. So he stormed out of the house, slammed the door, and left. He went in his truck and left. So I just wanted for you guys to do a welfare check on him. This was about 10 minutes ago, so it takes him about 25 minutes to get to his house.
So moving on, we'll show you some lapel mounted camera footage now from both of the deputies that were dispatched to the call. Here we see them there on the front porch of the residence, so we can go ahead and let that play.
Sheriff's Office.
So as I mentioned, unfortunately, deputies weren't able to make contact with the decedent at the house. They also spoke with a neighbor and attempted to reach Jared by phone, which was also unsuccessful. Deputies, as they exit the property and they're out of their vehicle, as is a common practice, they've turned off their lapel cameras, and then as soon as they hear the voice in the yard, the deputies turn their cameras back on right at the time he's reaching the fence. There's a significant distance between the trailer and the yard, the perimeter of the yard and the fence out by the street. So as soon as they heard him and recognized that he had come out, re-engaged their cameras right away, so they were able to capture the entire incident as it unfolded. As I mentioned, he does run out of the house initially. When he hits the street, you'll see him. You can watch the video, of course, for yourselves, but you'll see him running towards the deputies armed with a knife. So we'll go ahead and move to that portion of the video now.
You have a knife on your throat. Jared, stop right there. Stop right there. Stop right there. Jared, stop. Stop, we're gonna shoot you. Stop. You need to stop,
Pause it,
Jared.
Jamie. So the deputies are doing a number of things. The deputies are confronted with an armed subject who's closing distance on them pretty rapidly. You see him running, and then he slows down, presumably about the time they draw their weapons. That may have been enough to, potentially dislodge or disrupt his thinking at the moment. So he starts walking, but he never stops closing distance on the deputies. Clearly agitated state. You can just tell by his demeanor and the words that are coming out of his mouth towards the deputies. As he gets close, and we'll talk about distance when I get to the evidentiary photographs and the Faro scan of the actual scene itself, I'm going to show you just how close he was. I'd remind you that these cameras are wide-angle lens cameras, and so the depth perception of the camera is not identical as the human eye. So he's approximately 12 feet from the deputies, which is about the distance from me to you, sir, when the engagement happens. So it's quite close. Go ahead. Both deputies do engage simultaneously. It's almost instantaneous when they both fire.
Myself, 215 will be code 3.
You hear additional deputies that are keying up, indicating that they're en route to the location to assist
Jared,
them.
move away from the knife.
You can clearly see on the video the knife. They know he's armed with the knife, and now the knife is somewhere around his person there on the ground. He is not
Move away
deceased
from the
at
knife,
this
Jared.
time. Trying as best they can to give him verbal commands to move away from the knife. He does lay down, as you can see.
Give us 10-3, start 435.
That's a command to start rescue right away. So, before they even have the subject secured, they're already thinking about life-saving measures. You see the deputy walks up and kicks the knife away. And the video is pretty graphic, so for the purposes of a press conference, we cut it there. You'll have access to the whole video, as I mentioned, but just out of respect for the situation, we're not going to show the entire video today. So some of the evidentiary photos. This is the knife that he was armed with at the time. Basic kitchen knife. Nothing really extraordinary about that. It's just a basic kitchen knife. Just an overall photo of the scene. Those two vehicles are the initial deputy responding vehicles. They're on the right-hand side of the photo. We've blurred out the decedent's physical body. It's directly in the center of the street. You just can't see it because it's been blurred. Because of the life-saving measures that the deputies attempted to render to him, they had to remove a significant amount of his clothing. They applied chest seals to his body. They attempted to use an AED. Chest seals will... it's kind of complicated, but the chest seals are designed to go over gunshot wounds on the chest to prevent the collapsing of the lungs inside of the chest cavity. So all of our deputies are equipped with those items for just such a situation where they might need to render aid to a subject who has gunshot wounds to the upper torso. You can actually see the knife. Sorry, Jamie, can you go back just real quick? You actually can see the knife in this photograph. Surprisingly, after the deputy does kick it, the photo is high resolution enough that you can still make it out. And then you'll see a kind of a cluster of objects there between where the blurry portion is in the vehicle. That's some of the rescue equipment that was used to render life-saving measures at the conclusion of the shooting itself. I mentioned the term FARO-scan. That's the device that we use to do measurements of critical pieces of evidence that are on these scenes. It's a little difficult to make out, but I'll do my best to explain what you're seeing on the screen. There is a dashed line here that starts at the front bumper of this second vehicle, and the dashed line continues up to the decedent's position there. That distance is approximately 30.44 feet. Based on the collection of the remainder of the evidence on the scene, we're estimating that the deputies were here when they fired. If you were to kind of cut that distance in half, you can see that they're roughly in between 15 and 10 feet is about the positioning that they were when the actual engagement happened. Go ahead. A little about the deputies that were involved. Deputy Alvarez Ruiz, a deputy first class. This was his first deputy involved shooting, just shy of 2 years of service. And a Deputy Cordero, also deputy first class, first deputy involved shooting, and roughly 4.5 years of service. Information about the decedent, Mr. Jared Romero. He was 35 years old. As far as we could locate, we only could find one call associated with this subject, and it was also a call of a mental health type nature. The individual had arrived to our South Valley substation believing that he resembled a wanted subject and attempted to confess to a sexual assault that we don't believe he actually committed. He claimed to have committed that crime. None of that information could be confirmed at the time of the incident. At the time, he was not suicidal, but according to the report, had indicated that he had had homicidal thoughts in the past, but had never reported those. He was voluntarily transported to Caseman Hospital for an evaluation that day, but he had no, to our knowledge, no threats towards law enforcement at the time. So that being said, I'm happy to answer some questions, as is the sheriff. I just want to give you just a little bit of a reminder of the information about how these incidents are processed and the investigatory process that happens and is ongoing right now. So as a reminder, any sort of officer or deputy involved shooting that occurs here in the metro area is investigated by a task force. That task force is made up of detectives from all of the different law enforcement agencies that are here in the metro area. That criminal investigation is currently ongoing. Both of the deputies have been interviewed, and they voluntarily agreed to participate in that interview as a part of their investigation. I cannot speak directly to what was said in that interview. That report is not completed yet, and I wasn't there when the interview happened. So I would just ask that if you have specific questions about what they said in their interviews, you have to wait until the case file is completed. But of course, at that time, you can make a request and it'll be available to you. Secondarily, after that investigation is concluded, all incidents of this nature are subject to an internal affairs review as well, to look at policies, procedures, any of the administrative things that went right or needed some correction or improvement. And that's the case with not just deputy involved shooting incidents, but anything that gets referred for an internal administrative review. That process does take quite some time because unfortunately the administrative review can't start until we have submitted the criminal case to the DA's office and once that's completed. So there is a bit of a time delay on that portion of it starting, but it is for that reason. As far as questions go, I'm happy to answer those now. So are there any questions that I can answer for you?
This might be more for your behavioral health compliance manager, but I'm curious, in a situation like this, I've seen this a lot recently in police shootings where it's like someone's in a mental health crisis and they're telling officers, deputies to shoot them. And I was just curious, maybe from your perspective or one of your guys is telling someone who's approaching you with a knife to their throat, I'm gonna shoot you. I'm just curious, like, how that's seen in like a crisis intervention, like as a tactic, like in a crisis intervention type like approach to things.
So there is some case law about, you know, the necessity, and I would say some ongoing debate about the necessity to give a warning in a deadly force encounter. All I can tell you from the training standpoint of the manner in which our deputies are trained is, just as an example, we know from biomechanics studies that it takes the average human being on a level surface with adequate traction about 1.5 to 1.7 seconds to travel a distance of 21 to 30 feet and execute an attack. Now that doesn't mean that just because someone is inside of that distance that it's an automatic shoot scenario. There's a whole list of other criteria that they have to take into account when deciding whether or not it's objectively reasonable to pull the trigger. Suspect behavior, whether or not someone is aggressively advancing on them while armed with a knife, and then the deputies have to decide for themselves whether or not that constitutes in their mind an imminent threat of great bodily harm or death. And if they perceive that in a situation such as this, the ultimate question then becomes, is that objectively reasonable or not? To your point about giving a warning, it's almost a lose situation for us. If we don't give a warning, we'd be criticized for not giving a warning. And if we do, then the question becomes, well, is that really the right thing to tell somebody? The fact of the matter is that that warning is probably the truth. If an individual armed with an edge weapon is continuing to advance in an aggressive manner onto one of our deputies, they have every right to go home alive at the end of the shift. And they know through their training that there's a very high possibility that that individual, should they continue to advance, could very well execute a life-threatening attack on them. So I think the warning is something that's necessary. I think your point's well taken. What does that do to the mindset of the individual who's making those choices? I'm not sure that any of us could really predict that, but it's definitely an interesting question.
With the distance thing, is there like a point where like a taser is like kind of seen as like you're past that? Is that like is there like a point for an officer or deputy where like you're like told like don't do a taser at that point when they're at a certain distance? Is that?
I think the less lethal tools are fantastic. I mean, I'm a proponent and advocate of those, as are all law enforcement professionals. I think where the misconception in the public mind comes is when they think that we can instantaneously shift from one weapon to another, and you saw how fast this unfolded. It's not even physically possible for them to transition in a deadly force encounter. Nor would we train our individuals to respond to a deadly force encounter with a less lethal tool. Unfortunately, that's how people get hurt. I saw another hand.
Deputy Chief, this shooting
Yes.
happened just a couple days before you guys announced your new behavioral health manager. If this person was on the job beforehand, would this call been taken differently? Would you have had someone else there with your two deputies to kind of handle the mental health issue, since you knew this man had mental health issues?
We already have some of those systems in place. I think the sheriff will probably speak to that here in just a moment, so I'll leave that question for him. But so we're not swapping places repeatedly. If there's any other questions for me, I'm happy to answer those. But he'll talk about that.
Going back to Matthew's question, the man had the knife pointed at his own throat.
That's
as
correct.
he was approaching the
That's correct.
deputies. Why was that perceived as a threat to them rather than a threat to his own life?
So again, that's a question for the deputies in their interview. And it is up to those individuals to explain their actions. I'm not inside of their mind. You know, I can only speculate as to that. But I would tell you that there are some biomechanical studies out there that would show that the individual could very quickly turn that knife from himself, or a gun for that matter. It takes an individual holding a gun to their own head less than 1 second to turn that weapon and engage someone, and that's not enough time for you to even react.
But this wasn't a gun, this was a knife.
It wasn't a
Why
knife.
a taser the first approach, knowing that the knife was pointed at himself and he was making his own life threaten, or he was threatening his own life rather than theirs? Why wasn't the taser the first option rather than a gun?
Say your question one more time.
why wasn't a taser the first option rather than a gun, knowing that the knife was pointed at himself and not at deputies?
Yeah, I don't know that, I understand what you're saying, but I'm not so sure that I would agree with the characterization that it's not a deadly force situation for the deputies at the time. And so if they are perceiving that it's a deadly force situation at the time, to use a less than lethal tool like that is not the correct choice.
Do you know how many times he was shot?
I don't have that number now. If that's all for me, I'm going to hand it over to the sheriff. I think that's a great question. We'd like to expand on that a little bit. Thank you.
All right, I'll update you on some of the things that we are doing and changing, maybe to answer some of your questions. One of the things we're looking at is we always want to make sure that we're improving no matter what the call is, specifically when it comes to a mental health call. One of the reasons I hired my behavioral health compliance manager. One thing that we're looking at is initial information on dispatch that's obtained and how it's disseminated to our deputies, whether that's going to a call taker and our dispatcher to make sure that our deputies are being provided all of the right pertinent information on what they're actually responding to. Again, we're reviewing communications, technology, training, and policy. I told you the other day when I introduced Diane that our policy hasn't been updated since 2013, and that's for everybody to see. That's something that we are assessing immediately. Training to include percentage of the office in its entirety in crisis intervention training. I don't want to put a percentage on it, but we want to start getting it closer to where a lot more people have advanced training in CIT. I discussed the other day that I want a mobile crisis team, but at any point that's not always available. So I want to make sure there's always deputies on shift that have more advanced training in contrast to the mandatory 40 hours of basic training that you have in the academy for the state of New Mexico. A huge thing that I'm a proponent of, and we're looking at technology and tools. Immediately, a supervisor will be dispatched to assist with any type of mental health call that will provide a third person on the scene. It is not practical for me to make any call due to our manpower issues to have a 3-deputy call. But a supervisor, not just for looking over calls and making sure things are going correctly, but that person can also, to answer your questions, can also look at having a 40 millimeters, which I'm looking at on switching away from beanbag to a 40 millimeter to make sure we have another less than lethal tool available for our personnel. Technology, again, we're looking at all types of different body-worn cameras. And 1 or 2 companies that I'm looking at is a live stream, say an MCT unit or someone that's not as advanced in crisis intervention team and they have the time to do further de-escalation that can live stream into the call. And someone can also make sure that a mental health professional is talking to that individual. This also helps with the language barrier because we know we will be faced with that also. Training, I put in for capital outlay. A virtual reality training system as opposed to just a deadly force in a non-deadly force situation to make sure not only training and de-escalation speaking, putting our deputies in these types of scenarios that we just saw to make them a little bit more comfortable and make sure that the training is more practical and specifically so we're not taking deputies out of the field longer. This is just not for a basic academy for the virtual reality. Again, I think I'd explained it the other day that when we have this training, if we can take someone out of the field for 20 or 30 minutes, put someone in a scenario like this, we can make sure that we're addressing numerous problems. Community input for policy, which I'll have Diane talk for a little bit more. We're changing policy, but again, all the people, nonprofit, the community, we want them to have input into the policy that we provide for our deputies to make sure that we represent everybody in the constituents that we serve. And I'll let Diane speak again also, that another angle also is NMCAL. It's a 988 option. It's a New Mexico Crisis Access Line. If any of your family members are calling through a third party or another family member saying that they want to hurt themselves, please call that number also. It's a great tool. Tons of resources have been put into that to make sure that not all the time that law enforcement is responding to that call. From here, I'll respond to any other questions.
How many deputies are currently CIT trained?
All of our deputies are CIT trained basic 40 hours, but they are not trained advanced.
The ECIT?
That's what I'm trying to get further on to make sure, I don't want to get to a percentage, but we do need more deputies that are more advanced in CIT and to make sure eventually that we have all of our deputies trained in advanced CIT.
Okay, and were these 2 trained in the advanced CIT? You know?
I do not know for a fact. I don't want to answer that until the investigation is complete, but we'll find out, so I do not know to answer your question.
I don't know if you could tell us this, but what was, if you could give us like kind of what was the father's reaction to how this ended up?
I didn't speak to the father, but I will tell you this, and I'll speak in general, not specific to the father, because I don't want to speak for him. Whenever you have a loss of life, I'm pretty sure the response wasn't well. His son was needing help, whether or not it was suicidal or homicidal ideations. We want to make sure we never want to take a life, but we want to do everything to negate that. And that's what we're doing, and we're putting policies in place now and stopgaps to it. Myself as a father or any family member doesn't want to deal with that, so we're doing everything in our power to help our deputies and help our community. And Diana, if you want to speak a little bit more on NMCal and some of the community input for the policy.
We've got a specific question for Diane.
So what I have to add is just a little bit to that, but as far as policy goes, that is something that I was looking at in my first week here. When had it been updated? Are we current with best practices and so on? So like the sheriff mentioned, the SOP hasn't been really updated since 2013, and community input is crucial because there are some things that we might not be looking at, and language and everything is so crucial. So I have asked for some community input. I've already sent our SOP to people, mental health stakeholders that are willing to assist us as we create and kind of build this policy out. There's a lot to it. You know, there's law enforcement assisted diversion, there's mobile crisis teams, so there's a lot to look at. It's not going to happen overnight, but we're definitely working on it now. These types of situations, you know, they're important to note that they're triggering, and sometimes we like to let people know that there are other options out there as far as just getting your family members some assistance. I'm not talking about this situation in particular. I just like to remind the community that we do have 988. We have National Alliance on Mental Illness who can help out when families are struggling. They're not sure how to help out their loved one. And then the Mexico Crisis and Access Line. Yes.
Would you advise someone like this father in this situation to have gone to one of those other routes as opposed to what you did here?
So I think what I'd like to say is if he had reached out to us and our social workers, we would have developed some safety plans and an idea of where to go from there and some options, definitely.
And you did CIT for a long time, or the crisis intervention team. You know, could you just kind of tell us how would a situation like this be handled with like a clinic, with the CIT team, with a clinician and with a deputy? Like, how would this have played out in your mind from having such a long time experience in that? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one to answer because these are not cookie cutter situations, right? I know what we teach in training. You know, obviously to, if you can, and there are not weapons present, to try and calm the situation down, create distance, try to, you know, utilize verbal skills. Those are the basics, but we always say, you know, don't compromise your safety, your officer's safety. And so, again, they're not cookie cutter situations, so I can't speak to exactly what the deputies were thinking at the time. And they're fast, they're evolving, you know, and these are very fast situations.
So you're not certain that like a clinician would have helped in this situation?
That's a tough question because if mobile crisis team had been available, they probably could have been there to offer resources. But this is a tough one because it was fast and evolving. The officers got there and they attempted to try and make contact in another manner. So I can't speak more to that. I don't know if you have information.
Oh, we heard in the 911 call that the father told the dispatcher that his son has certain diagnosis, has a history of mental issues. How is that communicated then to deputies to know that, so they know what they're going into?
That's what my first bullet point that we're looking into is making sure and researching what information do our deputies have. What law enforcement databases do we have to see the history? That's one of the reasons that I've been mentioning that I really do want a voluntary website for families to send in information to us so that it's flagged better with our dispatch to know what we're going into. Because at the same time, we know a lot of this is health-based also. We might not even send a deputy at all. We might need to have that other third option, or we need to clear the call. So we're looking into make sure how it's disseminated to our deputies, make sure it's done properly. If there was a mistake found, we'll correct it. Like I said, we're always evolving, but we're looking into that.
And so how was it communicated in this case?
Communicates usually through radio and through CAD. And now it depends on how it's communicated through either our 10 codes or plain text language. What did the deputy perceive? Did they slow down and they look at another law enforcement database? That's something that we're still investigating. And again, if we have something to where there's a miscue on communication and there's a communication error, that's something that we have to fix immediately.
So with this case specifically, were these deputies aware that this was a wellness call with a person who could be suicidal?
Possibly. I just know it came out as a welfare check, and I don't know what a welfare check means to you, but to me, that's something a little bit more general. So we need to make sure in our policy procedures, we need to make sure that is exactly what we are going to, and there's no reason to rush to the call. And at the same time, again, looking at those policies and procedures, slowing the call down if we need to. Again, we need to make sure that we're giving our deputy every tool to know the situation that they're going into.
Thank you, sir. Folks, as I mentioned, please get with Jamie. We'll conclude there. Please get with Jamie. We have a thumb drive with the video and the presentation from today. If you have future questions, of course, you know how to get a hold of us. All right, thank you very much.